Okay, and welcome. Last week we left off talking about the first couple verses of Genesis chapter 2, and since then we've had 2 chapters worth of, frankly, some kooky reflections, and I want to warn you, they get kookier as we go on. So just know that, right? But hopefully they invite new ways of thinking through. And what I want to do, as always, and it's a terrible question, and I know that, but I just can't help myself, is see if there were passages or thoughts that either spoke to you, or quite honestly, ones you wanted to push back against, or things that weren't mentioned that you wanted to talk about. And we're really highlighting Genesis chapter, well, you can go all the way back to 1 if you want to. Chapters 1 through the beginning of chapter 4 is kind of our target right now. So let me open the floor, and please just unmute yourself and speak as you'd like.
Well, I have something. I'm finding it harder to read the scriptures, especially, Genesis, because things have been so perverted, so to speak, or turned up, or the truth has been compromised. As you pointed out in one of your writings, that the first human that was created by God was an androgynous creature, and that there was no sex until they were separated into two entities. Then the other thing is that Eve is blamed for the first quote unquote sin, and that in itself is not true, for the simple reason that she is, as you know, Eve is usually translated as life, and it's a derivative of God's own name, and which represents being in all of its possible modalities and tenses. And we see that Adam, who is said to represent the human race, his name is not part of God's name. His has to do with the earth. It's Eve that is the one who is the giver of life. She bears children, she nurses them, she is a life giver. And she's not only a life giver because she bears and nurses children, she bears a form of God's name. And so the way we treat women individually, socially, ecclesiastically, and politically represents the way we treat God. In other words, women are second-class citizens, and if we're not honoring the whole of God's creation as being equal, then our relationship with God is not in order either. And and of course, it goes on talking about others. Now, the thing about Eve is, a number of years ago, I thought maybe one of the things I needed to be doing was writing. So I did a lot of research about women. And from 9,000 BC to 2,500, what are you smiling about, Mike?
I'm just excited to see where you're going to go.
Okay. In 9,000 BC to 2,500 BC, there were a large part of our people were matriarchal. In other words, there was a woman leader. But the thing about that, the way that came about, as you know, probably from your history, that in the beginning, as human beings developed, they were hunter-gatherers. And usually it was the men who went out and did the hunting. Sometimes women went too. But the thing is basically, the women, as they begin to have children, they had to stay home and take care of the kids and keep the campfires burning and stuff, that sort. They are the ones because they were experimenting with the vegetation at the time. They found out what was it they could eat, what could be eaten and what couldn't be eaten. In other words, they are the ones who started farming. And the men usually handled the herds of animals. Okay, so as time moved on, God was regarded as female. The Queen of Heaven is from that time of history. Today, Roman Catholics call Mary the Queen of Heaven to supplant the first Queen of Heaven. The icons and the excavations have revealed all kinds of things that are feminine images of God. And also, you find that, you know, if you look, maybe some of you have come across these women that have been made out of clay, out of stone sometimes. So the whole focus was women ran the place, because if the guys are out hunting or taking care of the cattle, somebody's got to be home. So the women are the ones who really made a lot of discoveries that we have today. Now, there was one woman, I can't, Gaia, no, not Gaia, but I wrote her name down somewhere, but I'll be darned if I can find it. But anyway, there was a woman in what they called the land of Cush, which is in northern Africa. Now, Julius Caesar, she lived during the time of Julius Caesar. And Julius Caesar wanted her land, and so he invaded, and she beat the hell out of him. And he didn't bother anybody up in that area for 10 whole years. So, but she had and of course, all of her soldiers were women and some men. So the thing is this, is that gradually over time, the reason that society changed from a matriarchal society to a patriarchal society is that men from the northern part of the world, they were heavy into cattle industry, or things of that sort, and that part of the country got into drought, and so they started moving southward as to find land for their animals, and also to do so gradually that encroached on the lands that were controlled by the matriarchal societies. And so by 2500 BC, things are patriarchal. And around I don't know whether it around 2000 that our God was introduced on the mountainside. Is it about that time period?
I guess it depends.
Okay, well, anyway. So then you have this God whereby these men make everything male, and then you have the rest that goes throughout society. So the only reason I bring this up is that I have really difficulty reading these things that I know are not true. That were not totally, there may be other kinds of truth to them. I'm not negating them altogether, but at times it makes me angry. And that we have to still hear that story and that interpretation in churches that is like it has been for 2,000 years. And the church knows better. Especially the Roman Catholic Church knows better, and I'll be darned if they are going to do anything about it, because they are a male society and they are protecting themselves. So that's my quandary. It's just, if you've got any insight that can help me, that'd be great.
Well, I think that's a very open question for anybody who would like to respond.
Oh, come on, ladies.
Thank you, Meg, for laying that out so beautifully. And yes, back at you, exactly right. I'm thinking. I have the same turmoil about some of this, and I think in my heart I've kind of written a lot of it off, which is not helpful either.
No.
So, Mike?
Well, I see Darlene ready to comment, so I think that's good. And then I see Antha.
My comment is that, yes, Meg, absolutely yes. But also, this is one reason that I love St. Thomas, is that alternative views in history and science can be considered and consulted and have equal value and equal space, equal time with the traditional stories that have some truth in them. They have a lot of truth in them, but we're free to balance that truth, that story, with other stories that are true. So thank you, Meg.
Antha, I see you ready.
Yep. So as I said last week, I am reading a womanist midrash. I am also reading a book of female rabbi commentary on the portions of the Torah. And one of the things I'm getting out of them is that interpretation of these scriptures is not limited to a bunch of ancient guys 2,000 years ago, that it is perfectly okay for us and us as a community and as individuals to do our own creative interpretation. So the rabbi this week actually looked at this story and said that that Eve looks at the fruit and she thinks about it and she says, this is a good thing. This is not impulsive. And as Meg said, Adam's standing right there the whole time. You know, he never says, hey, honey, maybe bad idea. He's along with it, not unlike the flannel board version I grew up with, where Eve did it and then like found Adam and handed him an apple. And the rabbi says that we ought to reclaim Eve as the woman that started human history by reaching for knowledge and learning, and that we should reclaim that as the heart of the story, instead of this version where Eve is a temptress when there's not really any temptation going on her part.
Sandra, you're ready, and then I see Rhonda after you.
You're
Sandra,
muted.
you're still on mute, Sandra.
No, my mic wasn't showing muted. Can you hear me now?
You're on now.
Well, I had this thought, and it really saddened me, because I thought, what if just that one time Eve or Adam had turned to the other person and said, what do you think we should do? The whole of history would have changed if we'd started off in partnership. But that's just my thought.
Thanks. Rhonda?
I have more questions for later, but could you just quickly run through how our interpretation got to us where Eve is the temptress? Was it written in Hebrew and then translated into Latin and then translated into English? And kind of when did that happen?
So maybe it's helpful to know that, like, when did there become like a normative dominant interpretation? But I think it's really helpful to hear that, and maybe you've heard of this, like the Gospel of Thomas and the Nag Hammadi scrolls, right? There's always been dissenting ways people have read these. And there was a movement that came sort of about 100 years after Jesus called Gnosticism. And most lay people have heard of this now because of things like Newsweek, you know, writes these big things about Gnosticism. And it was a real thing, right? And it had followers. And gnosis is knowledge. And the idea was that there was secret knowledge that could sort of free you from your earthly prison. And the Gnostics actually viewed this story really affirmatively. In fact, they believed that there was an evil God that made matter, because matter is bad, spirit is good. I mean, by the way, you can see how we've swallowed some of this up to our detriment. And that actually the snake is the savior because the snake is trying to save people from ignorance. So they read this story as thwarting the evil God who encapsulated us in matter. There's another early guy called Marcion, and his legacy is the Marcionites. They were declared heretics, but you know, it was like very controversial at the time. So the real dominant interpretation came after. I mean, it's much newer than you might think, right? And I think I put in one of the articles that they sent out about St. Augustine, who, by the way, wasn't a terrible guy, but St. Augustine wasn't originally like Christian by any shape of the imagination. He was a Manichaean, so he believed in a duality between matter is evil and spirit is good. And he brought that into Christianity when he converted. And he wrote about something that all of us have normalized, which is the fall of humanity. But I will tell you, our Jewish brothers and sisters don't believe in that whatsoever. And the word fall is not in the Bible. It's in the headings put in your Bible, which are not in the text. And you know, this is a real shocker because like in general, we're all smart people, you know, we are. But sometimes we don't even realize those headings were put there by somebody. Like they're not, the Bible doesn't have headings in it. And the heading frames the way you read the whole story. So when did fall really come in? It's even newer than Augustine. You can read through liturgies, Rhonda, like whether they're the Catholic Missal or the Book of Common Prayer, etc. And we don't really get the idea that human beings are like absolutely like worthless and sinful and inherently bad until like the 1300s. Now that's interesting because the church I grew up in, particularly like the evangelical church, has totally swallowed that new idea. I want you to hear that. It's a new idea, not an old one.
So when did the translation happen? Well, there's
a couple of translations that happened, right? So in the year, around the year 100 BCE, Hebrew goes to Greek. And we talked about that 1-2 weeks ago, right? Where Hebrew was a dead language. It was sort of like Sanskrit is now. Only some kind of specialist would have spoken it. The lingua franca was Greek. So that got translated by 70 rabbis in Alexandria, which was like the center of learning in the world. And all of their translations agreed completely. That's the Septuagint. But again, that doesn't have the word fall either. When does it turn into Latin? St. Jerome does that in the 300s CE when Greek had fallen, and now there was this barbaric tongue being spoken, and they considered it barbaric Latin. It's why it's called the Vulgate. It was considered a vulgar language. And Jerome did this. He actually was very ahead of his time. He consulted not only like Christian scholars in Greek text. Jerome like went looking for rabbis so he could translate from Hebrew and rabbinic thought into Latin. But once that happened, once we got the Vulgate, we sort of have been stuck there until we got folks like John Wycliffe and William Tyndale and Martin Luther right on the age of the Reformations who gave us, you know, took the previously vulgar turn and vulgarized it some more. I mean, that's sort of what happened with the vernacular translations.
So when was it decided that it was Adam's rib instead of the side of Adam?
I wish I knew the answer to that. I want to say it's definitely in the Vulgate. Mm-hmm. So that definitely would have happened with Jerome. And I'd have to go back and see if that's in the Septuagint or not, if that's in the Greek translation.
Okay.
The problem with rib, right, is that sometimes we think, oh, it's just a little rib. You can live without that. But again, that loses the sense that this is not something you can live without. And that's a really important thing. This is not a bit of humanity. It's carving out the side. And that's been so I will tell you that there is some ambiguity, because remember, when you've got a language with 10,000 words, it's not a lot of words. So there's always like options in words, right? But that whole bit about side and major part is like embedded in Hebrew. It's not in Latin. And again, with Greek has 100,000 words, you just lose the range of meaning because you've got a whole lot more categories you can put a deep word into, if that makes sense. Antha?
I had a funny thought on this story before we move on, which is at the beginning, the snake says something to Eve that is only half true. And like someone being wrong on the internet, Eve can't stand it and she has to respond to him and correct him. And I thought that was funny.
Well, I appreciate it. And I hope you notice that Eve says something that is not completely true either. She says, you can't even touch the fruit or you'll die. And again, you start to wonder, where did she get that idea? Is it what the, and by the way, it's really important to remember that people don't have names. We retroactively call them Adam and Eve, but they're not called that. They're called like the dirt thing and the female. So, you know, did the principal human being, like the game telephone, corrupt what God said? Or did the principal human being do essentially what all of us do? Hey, you shouldn't eat it, which means don't even touch it. Because if you don't touch it, you can never eat it, right? Do we add layers to it for self-protection? Either way, it's a corruption of what happened originally. And, you know, I didn't know, it's been a long time since I wrote those. I can't remember exactly if I talked about this, but consider that like what we often need in life are positive mentors. Imagine being the only human being. Like, how do you know how to be human when you're the only one? Well, you're going to look to somebody to emulate, whether frankly that's a gorilla or a wolf or God. Who better to be like than God? I mean, you know, like it's interesting to say like, oh, you know, those darn human beings trying to be what they're not supposed to, trying to be like God. I hope we want to be godly. You know, I mean, like it's an interesting way that we condemn people for trying to be something really great, quite honestly, right? We should all strive to be better than we are. Well, I think so. I mean, to be godly, like that's the whole point of the Christian journey, I thought, you know, but don't be too good at it. You know, I mean, that's an interesting way you can read this story. So like, there's a number of ways in which you can read who's the villain and who's the hero. And that can happen a whole lot of different ways. And I hope what's interesting is to think through like, hey, we can read these things prescriptively, like you ought to act like this, or we can read these as describing us. And I hope it was interesting for you to hear that there is this really strong option that this is not the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that it's the tree of knowledge, and knowledge is good and evil. It is. And I think it's actually really clever in this old text that we would much rather pick knowledge than pick life. I mean, I do think that's something fundamentally true about human beings, male or female, quite frankly. Rhonda, please.
So right before you started writing about Eve being created, you were talking about God creating either out of loneliness or out of diversity and complexity. So loneliness kind of leads to a codependency, and then diversity and complexity leads to interdependency. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that. I just so I can get a better gist of what you mean.
Well, I mean, I think probably the expert on the screen is actually Darlene, not myself, you know, but, you know, like the mark of a truly unhealthy relationship is codependency, right? That's where I depend upon you in order to be me, instead of our relationship is based on people who have their own identity already, right? And so they're able to depend on one another. I mean, independency, we like to be independent, but let's be honest, nobody's independent. And I remember Barack Obama saying something this about, like, hey, we all drive these roads. You didn't build that road. I mean, like, that is a really interesting thought, right? Is that we depend on one another for roads. We depend on one another for commerce. I mean, you can say you built your own business, but you needed people to buy your product. I mean, it's not like you really are self-made. Darlene, is it okay if I asked you to weigh in psychologically on this? I mean, again, codependency, not great. It's really going to set you up for a lot of unhealth. You don't have to comment if you don't want to.
I was having trouble with my unmute. Yes, absolutely. The healthier is the interdependence, the cooperation, like Sandra talked about, consulting one another, sharing ideas, sharing tasks, sharing responsibilities, sharing ourselves with each other rather than having to have that connection. So psychologically, we're much healthier if we go the interdependence route. Is that what you were looking for?
And I think it's really fair to say, like sometimes you see this in movies, like people are like, well, I'm going to have me a baby so there'll be someone to love me. That's codependency, and it's not going to work out great, right? Because that's a whole lot that you're giving on somebody who doesn't have that capacity.
Yeah.
Right. And look, I mean, it's not like any of us are purists, right? But I think there is this opportunity where you think through like, hey, creation flows out of who God already is instead of God creating something that's needed. And to me, that's an interesting thought, because the theology I grew up with was either God needed people to praise God, so we're made to praise God, which is, that can't be right. You can even read this in God's Trombones. Since we're still in February here, James Weldon Johnson wrote some really fantastic poems, but the poem says, God says, I'm lonely, I'll make me a world. And I love James Weldon Johnson, but I don't love that line because I didn't think it's good or right, to be honest. And I wish I actually had a lot of wisdom. I'll just tell you a quick story. There was this famous Christian ethicist called Stanley Hauerwas. He's really quite famous among us theological nerds, and he writes about ethics from the Christian perspective. And Bishop Doyle brought him to a clergy conference my first year here. So it's been almost 6 years ago, and paid him a good amount because he was, a highly sought after professor. And I kid you not, he gave the most boring address I've ever heard in my life. He read it off of some like handwritten notes that I swear, sorry, Stanley, if you're watching this, were like 20 years old. I mean, he hadn't written it for us. It was about, I mean, I didn't even know why he was telling it to us. And the last thing he said was, if I was going to teach a class now to undergraduates, with all that I know, the one class I would want to teach is loneliness and marriage. And then he sat down and I thought, for the love of the Lord, why didn't you give us that class right now? Because it's really interesting. I sort of grew up with this idea that part of what marriage is there to do is make it so you're not lonely. And that's just the definition of codependence, right? And one of the things I think we struggle with culturally is the idea that being alone is not the same as being lonely. I don't know what to do with that theology, but I think it's pretty strong. John?
You make an interesting point. I have noticed that I have single friends who are completely content during this time of COVID to stay home alone and not necessarily they don't have a need to be around people as much as others do, like me. So I find it interesting that people who I would have thought would be in need of other people aren't, and they're not lonely.
I will say that the sources of deepest pain in my own marriage is when I expect my wife to do something for me. I don't mean like a way of showing me she loves. I mean, when I depend on her to meet some sort of identity, that's going to result in a lot of pain for both of us, if not in the present, then down the future, because it can't be done.
Mike, the healthiest relationships are those where there are two circles. The partners have their own identity, their own ideas, their own interests, their own activities, and they move in this circle so that there's a part of the circle that overlaps, but there's a lot of the circle that is independent. So there's an overlapping where you're sharing who you are with the other one, but it's not, you're not enmeshed. The circles are not enmeshed.
I really appreciate you saying that, Darlene, and probably some of you heard me do this last year, but and listen, Genesis is not talking about the plurality inside of God at all. I'm really positive about that. But since we have that thought, right, with Trinitarian theology, I don't know that we can prohibit ourselves from reading into it. But you know, this is the classic Trinity diagram, and you can see the shading there in the middle. That's where all three persons of the Trinity, like, that's where they have in common. But look, there's a whole lot about the Father that is neither in the Son or the Spirit. And I didn't get that diagram as a kid, but it's really interesting to think through. Like, they didn't share everything in common. They just share that little bit in common. And look, the Father and the Son have this part that the Spirit is not in at all. I mean, the diagram says that. That's how you read a Venn diagram. And I'm not sure that's awful. I think it's really interesting to think about. Susan, by the way, we don't have to keep talking about this. So whatever you guys want to talk us about, what we're here to do.
Okay, well, I was just going to say that my brother and I did DNA testing. And you would think, because both of us come from the same parents, that the DNA would be the same, but it's not.
Yeah.
So you take from each other parts, and parts you don't. You know, so it meshes in a different way. And that helps, you know, you to be interdependent, but not codependent.
Yeah, thanks. And I think you bring up a really good point, which is that when you look at identical twins who do have the same DNA, they're very rarely identical. Even though that's a fun game to play when you're an identical twin, apparently. John.
So I have a question, changing the subject somewhat.
Please.
Yeah. There, in reading the books, there are statements, if you will, in here, or lines in here that I'd kind of like to know why it was written into the text. And one that kind of caused me to wonder more than maybe others is it's chapter 3:15. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. It's not that, it's the next thing. He will strike your head and you will strike his heel. What does that mean?
I don't know.
Okay, fair enough.
I mean, in general, right? Snakes bite you in the feet and you step on them. I mean, that's, you know, I don't really know what else to say.
Why would they write that into this text? Why would the Hebrew, I mean, there must have been some significance.
Well, yeah, and I think the thing is, anytime we're trying to figure out why somebody wrote something, we need to start out by saying all we can do is guess. If we ever think we're sure why something happened, then that is like the definition of idolatry, right? It's called projection as well. So I don't know what to tell you. You know, this is an interesting thing that I try to point out a few times as we go along is a lot of what is going on behind the text, we don't know. Like, it's just been lost. And you'll really see it in Genesis 6 when it talks about these legends that are head scratchers, you know, like the people at the time must have had a whole lot of background that we haven't recovered yet. So I don't know what to tell you about snakes. I mean, in general, it seems like human beings find snakes pretty creepy. I don't want to overgeneralize because there are those weird people out there that love snakes. But Antha?
Yeah, so in Robert Alter's book, he talks about his translation of this, which is he will boot your head and you will bite his heel. And he says that those are homonyms in Hebrew. The first one meaning to trample, and the second maybe meaning the sound the snake makes before it bites you. So it may have been some wordplay.
Yeah, and
that we missed.
there's always that possibility. And then you have to remember, I put this in a reading, that there's a book Rudyard Kipling wrote called The Just So Stories. How did the jaguar get its spots? I don't know if you've read these. They're really kind of fun. They're nonsense, right? But they really are trying to say, like, how did this strange thing happen that's in nature, you know? And they're inventive and imaginative, and they're called etiologies. And quite honestly, Genesis is full of them. And just like the Kipling stories, sorry, it is not true that the rhinoceros got its skin because a Parsi put some crumbs in it. I mean, that is not true. It's fun, but it is not true. So these, I think, are the important things we get to think through. I know what you might be thinking. I mean, this is the word of God. It has to be true. But I want to remind you, no, it isn't. The word of God is the resurrected Jesus. And the scriptures are clear about that. I wish I had known that as a kid. I thought they were synonyms, the Bible and Jesus, but they're not. Not in the Bible, not in the creeds. And this, I think, is important to remember. So the question I think we always have before us, and Meg, I appreciate you raising this up front, right, is in what ways do these offer opportunities for life? A lot of the tales are cautionary tales, or they say, this is descriptive. You want to play it out like this. And I put this in the writings, but I think it's really interesting to think through. I grew up that men are dominant because they are. And then there's this great question like, hey, in Eden, that wasn't the case. So why do you want to live like that? Like, why do we want to live in a fallen world if that's not how it's supposed to be? It seems like instead of embracing that, our goal is to push against it. I don't even think the text is saying that, but if you believed it, why do you want to settle to live in a fallen world? I mean, that's the crazy bit. Anthem, please.
All right, I've got one more since folks are being quiet. This is from the Womanist Midrash. So Mike, you can comment on her translation of Hebrew because I sure can't.
Well, maybe I'm no expert. Yeah.
After God's discovered them and he tells the snake he'll bite the heel, then he tells Eve what her results are, her consequences for this action, and the standard translation is that man will rule over her. And the Womanist Midrash says that the preposition that's used for with, that's the standard translation is he shall rule over her. And the Womanist is arguing that the more standard translation of that preposition would be either in or with, which is an entirely different meaning, but I don't know any Hebrew, so I have no idea, how to take that.
Yeah, well, it is fair to say, again, in a language with few words, that there's myriad meanings. Yeah, I think that's very fair. And prepositions particularly have a lot of ambiguity. And just to give you an example, when you read the Psalms, there's often an ascription as to who wrote the psalm. And often what you'll find in your Bible is it'll say, by David. And that word by can also mean about, concerning, attributed to. All of those possibilities are there. And so sometimes we settle for something because we have to settle. I mean, our brains actually did not evolve to be delighted with ambiguity, but it's important to hold up the ambiguity, I think. Yeah, thank you. And remember that word rule is also a terrible word because the word again is mashal, which is shepherd. And that's just a really different way of hearing a rather harsh word. Dominion, we often think of domination, but dominion is from the word domicile, right? It's making home. And I don't know if you saw the one today about Cain, right? But the text reads, sin is crouching at your door and you have to mashal it. You have to shepherd it. Not dominate it. You have to treat it like a member of your flock. That's an interesting thing to think about. Darlene, go ahead, please.
And to me, that again is pointing to our healthy behavior, accepting parts of ourselves that are going to stay there, but learning how to manage them, learning how to control them, self-control, self-management, not self-denial or not flogging ourselves for who we are, but realizing that these are parts of us that are difficult, create problems for us, and we just need to learn some coping mechanisms so that we don't hurt ourselves or others by that part of us.
I really appreciate that. And if it's okay, I'd like to remind you that we have these 3 words. Most of us only know the middle word. We say things like, oh, he's got a big ego. There is no such thing as a big ego. Freudian psychoanalysis is predicated that your ego, this is the Greek word I am, is who you are. And your ego is actually really great. The problems we have are our id, and the id is the one that wants to do everything right now. The id is the thing in the Stanford marshmallow experiment that eats the marshmallow as soon as it comes into our hand, that cannot delay gratification. The id is the one that wants to compete with other people on the treadmill of hierarchical value. Then we also have the superego, and that's the one that says, no, don't do that, and otherwise known as repression, right? So I would tell you, if you're talking about a politician and you say they have a big ego, they probably have a big id, to be honest. They have an id problem, not an ego problem. Oh, you're just playing semantics. I don't think so. I think it's really important to think through. God made the ego to be really great. We only have an ego problem when our superego overfunctions or our id overfunctions. So reclaiming the id is about reclaiming who God made us to be, no more and no less. No more, that's an id problem. No less, that's a superego problem. I think all of this is in the text, by the way. I know it might sound crazy, but I think the text is full of this kind of stuff. I just want to ask out of curiosity, was this the first time you'd heard about Midrash? Was the word Midrash new to anybody? Because we read through where I talked about the Lilith story that came out of Midrash. Had folks heard that before? Or it was new to some of you? It's really interesting, and I think I mentioned to you that our Jewish brothers and sisters don't just read the text. They've got the text, rabbinic commentary, commentary on commentary, and they've got some midrash that goes along the bottom that's just really filling in these imaginative gaps, right? And just to give you an example, there is such a thing called Christian midrash, like the fall. That's Christian midrash. It's not in the text. It's an idea that's become normative to how we read the text, but it is not textual. It is definitely not in the minds of the original audience, because how do I know that? Jewish people still don't believe in it. We can point to historically where the idea came up, not with Jesus 400 years later. That's not to say that the idea is without merit. It's just not in the text. And I think it's really important to hear, and these are things that, I mentioned this week that a lot of us churches don't do really well. To me, it's really important to have a tight rein on terms, because again, human beings can't create anything biblically. Only God can do that. And that seems like it really matters. You know, I've heard sermons where we're co-creators with God, and no, we're not. And the reason that matters so much, right, is if God creates us good, we can resist it, but we can't accomplish it. I mean, we can't categorically change something God has created.
Well, one of the ways I think about that is that our relationship with God is a two-way street, so to speak. In other words, God rules supreme. And it is our responsibility to work with God, to listen to God, to be with God. So it's sort of, I don't know whether the word partnership is appropriate, but the thing is this, is that no, we don't co-create with God. We become who God created us to be by cooperating with God.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting way to frame it, Meg. And what I appreciate about what you said is that, frankly, there's a whole lot even more ambiguity in the text than we normally approach, right? And you can read folks like former Bishop, well, he's still the Right Reverend John Shelby Spong, right? Who says, look, some of us don't believe in a transcendent bodily being like God anymore. So God is like the nexus living into the universe, conspiring towards your own like corporate good, you know? And whichever way you read, right, whether there's a physical transcendent God or God is really like the harmony and possibility, they take you to the same place. You know, I mean, I think that's the interesting thing. So there's room for that ambiguity because either option or all the ones in between can take us to the same place together. I don't know if that made sense. That might have sounded like it came out of nowhere, because it did. Kathy, please.
I liked your reading from today where you talked about Cain and Abel, and you said, for all we know, they were 12-year-olds wrestling with each other. And we just don't know, but we've turned Cain into this terrible villain.
Yeah. Yeah, it reminds me of the time my brother body slammed me and I hit him in the shins with a broom. I mean, both things were terrible and we were children. You know, I mean, we just were children. He was bigger than I was, so he was kind of big evil Cain or whatever. I mean, it's interesting the motives we project into these characters, though, and I think that's the important thing to hold before us. John?
You mean you and your brother didn't have rules?
Yeah, we had unspoken rules, like you don't hit the face or the genitals. Those were unspoken.
Well, my brother and I, those were spoken rules, because you hit the face and there might leave a mark, and then mom and dad would have known that we were fighting. So we weren't allowed to do that. So I'm interested to hear that you guys had something similar, even though it was unspoken.
Well, mom and dad had different rules, to be honest. Mom preferred we not fight, and dad actually was like an advocate of fighting. That's the interesting thing. So who won out? I don't know. I do distinctly remember my mother telling us one time to go in the yard and kill each other. And of course, that was a moment of frustration that she didn't mean. But, you know, she communicated her feeling. We did not do that. I can remember violating the unspoken rules like twice. The shin hit, that was probably a pretty low blow, but I was 3 years younger and smaller, you know, and my brother was an All-American swimmer. So like it was kind of hard for little old me. That's where the story, I think, is so interesting, right? Like the way we read Cain and Abel, a lot of it comes down to our understanding of like assemblyhood and competition, you know. Lila, please.
Mike, can you, what's going on with the Cain's one offering being having God had regard for Abel's offering, but no regard for Cain's offering? The grain versus the lamb.
Yeah, I mean,
What's
so
God doing there?
nobody knows. And I actually really
Mhm.
appreciate the idea. I mean, remember, this is all anthropomorphisms, right? So we're explaining God with the ways that we can understand. And maybe there's truth to it, and maybe at a certain point it becomes untrue and becomes detrimental to us, right? But a lot of people will read, well, look, this is setting the stage for animal sacrifice. But I mean, that's crazy. That hasn't come up yet. I mean, it hasn't. And, you know, like if you're reading the text, were people killing animals or were they vegetarians? I mean, you know, like we don't seem to know the answer to that. And what a lot of people want to know is, why did God prefer one over the other? So again, we project a lot of things on a blank screen, but I want to put before you what I think is great about this text is, I mean, sometimes I'd rather have blue than red. In general, I'd rather have blue than red, but there's days where red appeals to me. So I don't always know why I'm attracted to something on any given day. I just am. And in the future, it might change. And the question is, like, what do we do about that? What I love, and then forgive me for saying this, I think it was the title of today, right? I mean, shit happens, and it does. And what are you gonna do when shit happens? Are you gonna collapse, or are you going to like continue to be faithful? I mean, I think that's a really important question of faith. And I don't know if you've had this experience, but I used to teach school, and I will tell you, and please, I'm not talking about anything like sexual or even physical, but I found myself attracted to certain students. I had like a rapport or an interest. And a lot of times it's because we had similar like habits, or they were inquisitive. And sometimes that wasn't the case at all. Like I had students that were lazy and kind of rough around the edges, and I couldn't explain why I was attracted to them. Like I had no idea. And did it matter? No. Should I give them preferential treatment? No. I mean, I think I think the text might be describing that situation. I mean, if I'm really fair, this is going to sound really dangerous, and it maybe isn't your experience, but like, hey, I love my kids, but it doesn't feel the same. Like love feels very different between the two of them. And I could beat myself up for that, but I can't control how I feel. If you can control how you feel, please tell me the secret. But I think I can only control what I do with my feelings. I think the story is about that. It's interesting to think like maybe God is, I mean, the author is saying like maybe God has inexplicable delight in things for no real reason. Because we're like that. It's a projection, but it nails us pretty well as human beings. Julia, oh, you're playing with the ball. Or are you raising your hand? Okay. Lila, was that right? Sorry.
Watching the curly-headed cherub that's been climbing over the sofa has been an abject lesson in don't take yourself too seriously.
I think it's been delightful.
Yeah. It's a lot easier to be delighted in like kids' behaviors when they're not yours. But it isn't a delight to the rest of us, I want to say. Yeah. Anything else for the good of the cause this week? Well, I'm grateful you're showing up and reading along. And I do hope that there's ways in which the text is like, frankly, becoming more ambiguous and honestly offering more opportunities. I hope excessive opportunities are delightful instead of like, fighting our brain that wants certainty and a singular narrative. Because I think it's really important. And what I appreciate, actually, there's a little book called Peculiar People, the Episcopalians, and it talks about how, like, one of our core convictions is that we're not united in doctrine, and we don't have to be, but that we get to be united in worship. And that, to me, that's a really hopeful and interesting thought, right? That diversity is really great. And I think Darlene did this with me. Carolyn did it with me for sure. There was this training called Dismantling Racism. Oh, and Antha did it too. And the most powerful part of the thing for me was a day that we looked at a whole bunch of ethnographic art. And the thing was designed to say that each and every one of us is an expression of God's artistry. And as a kid, I grew up thinking that only realistic art, like photorealism, was art. And I would see modern art and I would say really, really unthoughtful things like, I could do that. And of course, no, I could not. And it's interesting to think, right, that we would really lack a lot of beauty if we only had photorealistic art. And as much as I hate to admit it, maybe I am a piece of God's modern art. But that reminds me that I should appreciate that because it's God's artistry. And if we only had photorealism, we would miss what a lot of other forms of art do. Offers a view at the interior, what's inside of the bare bones, And I think that seems like a really important conviction that I think the text invites us to, actually, is that there's many ways of seeing, and when you put them together, you start to get something a little more robust and a lot more life-giving. So I hope that bears out. I'm going to warn you again, the things are going to get weirder and weirder.
Okay. Mike, before we go, I have an extra copy of the Women's Bible Commentary. And if any one of you would like to have, I ordered a new one by mistake. I looked for a whole day for this book, ordered the other book, same copy, and found it when the other one was on the way, in which I got yesterday. So rather than send it back, I want to offer to any of you who would like to have this Women's Bible Commentary that gives you a feminine perspective on it. So there's no cost here. So first come, first serve. Just let me know.
Thank you. And as always, if I can provide you a resource that's either on my shelf or even if you're just looking for something like, hey, I'd like to know more about rabbinic perspectives, I'd be grateful to share that with you. And one of the great things that's worth me repeating that came up even this week, Antha used the word womanist commentary, and maybe not everybody knows what that means, but womanist theology is Black female theology. And it's very clear, these are people like Alice Walker and Dolores Williams who have said, look, white feminism does not speak for me. So what's interesting, and this has happened a lot in the last 25, 30 years, is that there's multicultural hermeneutics. So, like there's a Latin hermeneutic, and it's called actually mujerista theology. This is Latinx women's theology. So it's not to be confused with white feminism, because as we all sort of know, white women have more power than Latinx women and Black women. In fact, I took a class in seminary called Issues of Women in the Christian Tradition, and really what it should have been called was global feminism, because there is a sort of a hermeneutical lens that comes out of women's experience in South Korea that does not fit white feminism. And there's African feminism, which is different from womanism. And what's great is being able to hold room for these different sort of light filters. I think it's a way to hear it, like that filter out certain lights to make other ways of seeing a little more visible. So if you're interested in any of those kinds of things, I'm more than happy to also share them or talk more about them in the future, because those are hermeneutical lenses that maybe you haven't thought of. one of the biggest ones that's come up in the last 15 years is called postcolonial criticism. And it's a way of thinking about, hey, like we could read these texts very imperially, or we could try to identify, decode, and unleash some of the colonial spirit with which is embedded in the text and we've normatively put into what this means. Okay, thanks for joining. Grateful to be having this conversation with you, and I will see you next week, if not before.